Jonas. We are in Provence, probably now. I can hear just about in the background the sounds of birds. Very envious because in Finland we only just see in the first of nature right now. Today we're going to speak around the path of economy, which is actually related to the notion of flow and trance. And this is part of a bigger conversation that Jonas and I have been having for actually now almost 6 months. If you look back, Jonas, from where we started, it's one of the last sessions we're recording today, and we're looking at this archetype wheel, which is a series of hand-drawn archetypes that I've been using for personal growth, personal development, with myself and with people I coach, university students, musicians, artists, people changing jobs and careers. And each of these archetypes that you can just about see here, when you zoom into it, and I'll zoom in a second, they're always organized in a line. And each line, we go in one session at a time. And today, we're going through the path of economy, which I'll now zoom into a little bit more here. Path of economy, where we have the first archetype of the consumer, the player, and the manager, with the sacred practice at the end. So Jonas, like, now that we've framed this and that we jump in usually from the archetype, which is the yin archetype, as we call it, the one that's first focused on oneself and receiving. Consumer. From a therapy perspective, when you look at people, you've probably had loads of people who come in and who have issues, both positive sides and the negative sides around being a consumer. What does it mean, the archetype of a consumer?
At the very, I think being in a position where you have to go out and buy in some way something that you hopefully need. Most common challenges I see around this are people who have a compulsive way of spending and who end up spending more than they earn and put themselves in situations where obviously that's detrimental to their overall balance. There's often the question of emotional regulation being tied into that. People that spend, it's a way to treat myself. I've had a shit day at the office. I deserve a little something good, right? And because I feel it's legitimate, I genuinely deserve it. No one else is going to give it to me apart from myself. Well, I'm spending it, I'm buying it for myself, and I feel good in that moment. And it's often a way to kind of, yeah, self-soothe. Or you would have also people with addiction issues who end up spending way too much money, even though they know that they're spending way too much money. But it's the addiction taking over for them. That's how they feel, that they don't really have a choice at that level. So if we look at some of the pitfalls, yeah, it would be blind compulsion, and the lack of a distinction between the what you actually need and what you want. But on the good side, it could be the mindful, deliberate consumption. I know that I need to buy stuff to some degree, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to choose quality. I remember I had an old lady as a patient, who had this expression: "I'm too poor to buy bad quality stuff because I can only afford to buy it once." And I thought that was a nice way to frame it.
I'm too poor to buy bad quality stuff. Yeah, I've heard that actually. Well, it's also very common in the Nordics, where people value quality, good quality design, lasting design that doesn't sort of get thrown away in the next season. So the value of consumption and looking at it, if in the positive way, looking at the consumer as an archetype, meaning if I want to embody that archetype, it means I want to just enjoy being the responsible buyer. Where do I put my power? Where do I put my money? Where do I put my time?
Yeah. I'll give you a concrete example. I happen to enjoy good beer and good food. And obviously in Marseille, I have a million different places where I could spend that money. And because I'm trying to have a positive impact on my ecosystem, I want the people that I like to do well. And I actively don't want to support what I don't believe in. So what I try to do is I try to shy away from the major supermarkets for a whole range of reasons. And whenever I'm buying beer, cheese, or artisanal products, I try to get it from. I have two friends, one of whom has a Italian delicatessen, and the other one has a like wine cellar bar thing. And obviously, it's a little bit more expensive, but I'd rather buy that stuff less often, but make sure that at the end of the day, it's going to my mates, and I'm not having to renounce my pleasures. And for fruit and veg and other stuff, I found little local suppliers from really the area where you buy directly from the farmers, and honestly, it's a win-win all around because it's cheaper in terms of the fruit and veg and the meat. It's so much tastier. It's seasonal. I don't have to even think about recipes. I'm just like, well, this is what's available. This is what I'm going to cook. And that way I get to feel aligned. I don't know if I really am aligned, but I get to feel aligned with my
Mm.
kind of values. And I get to know that the money that I make is actually benefiting. It's being passed on to do something that is beneficial instead of feeling bad about myself and just buying all the mega corporate brands,
Mm.
and then saying, oh, the system is destroying the planet, but then feeling in cognitive dissonance because I'm sipping my soda and eating my processed food.
So actually, it just segues into, you remember when we do those conflict boot camps, and the one of the big sort of unlocking factors in conflicts is understanding that there is a need that hasn't been fulfilled, and usually it's because it hasn't been identified, it hasn't been expressed, and therefore the person hasn't taken responsibility for their need, and they project it onto the outside, onto somebody else, and then it becomes a conflict. So another thing that comes from the archetype of consumer is somebody who gets in conflicts a lot might want to be looking at the consumer archetype and say, look, I want to embody the responsible consumer because I want to take ownership of my needs. I don't want to be the one who's constantly in conflict with the world, with my family, with my friends, with my colleagues, because I haven't actually identified and expressed and fulfilled my needs. So I think the sort of positive side as well of the consumer archetype is somebody who has been in conflict and wants to get out of that negative spiral that nobody really enjoys in constant conflict with the world. So that's the first one. Once that is checked off the box, okay, then we move on to the next archetype, because these are often working like you build that one, you experience then this one, and then you eventually balance the first two and experience the third one. So what's the player archetype around? Is this about video games, or what is that archetype, Jonas? Like, maybe we could open that up a little bit.
So generally this is more, if you imagine somewhat like make it more tangible at the professional level. It would be people who have a specialist function. They're not
Mm.
managers, they're not dealing with the group dynamic as much. They are providing something. They are not just consumers. They are actually giving value. They're producing a service, a good, or something, knowledge, whatever it is, art. But they have something to actually sell on the market.
Like
Um,
a developer. Like, I'm just in my mind popped in a sort of typical developer profile working on coding, who's mostly focused on the comfort of their code and the art of their coding, and who's in almost that gaming playing mode of flow. Is that
mhm.
part of the archetype as well?
Yeah, that could fall in that bucket easily. And generally, what you see as a big challenge for that level would be finding the balance between doing what you enjoy and doing what you know is going to sell or what you believe is going to sell. It's
Mm.
the if you're a DJ, it's the difference between, do you know that your audience is mostly from the 70s and 80s and they're going to want to hear the classics from their youth, or are you going to play the music that you want to listen to right now, or are you going to find a compromise between the two and make sure that everyone is enjoying at least something.
Mm.
So very often it's hard and it's tempting to compromise and to, if you're a musician, make pop because you know that that sells, but then you don't enjoy making it, and then you're like, well, why am I a musician if I'm making something I don't enjoy? I can just go back to office work in that case. And inversely, if you're like an office worker, it's hard to find that intrinsic motivation and that reward or drive in some of these corporate jobs where you're sitting in front of a computer the whole day filling in spreadsheets. It's very hard to have the mindset to find that rewarding in itself and for that to be intrinsically motivating. Most people, unfortunately, nowadays work for the paycheck. They just painstakingly get through the day, counting the hours till the moment where they get to clock out, and just spend most of their year thinking about the couple of weeks of holiday they have. So at that level, there is a real challenge when it comes to taking risks and daring to do what doesn't make you want to hit your head against a wall. And generally, it's a good idea not to force yourself to do that. It's rare that we really have to sacrifice and renounce intrinsic motivation. Generally, it's more about really finding a way to tap into it and being creative enough to organize your job or to do whatever you're doing in a way that is still motivating enough. And that's actually one of the most common causes of suffering that I come across at work, in my practice. It's rarely actually psychopathology in the strict sense of the term, like people that have
Mm,
actual disorders. It's more people that get to pathological levels of distress because of these everyday problems of work, relationships, and why the hell am I getting up in the morning kind of a thing.
mm,
Existential level stress, I guess you could call it. So
yeah.
this is actually a very important level, and it's wherever, whatever you're producing, whatever you're giving, it's a good idea to ask yourself um, why am I doing it, and what about this is fun? Like not we tend to really undervalue fun and say there's productive things and then there's fun stuff. But in practice, we are the most productive when we're having fun. I think that's something you can probably maybe you have some stories about that actually, Esther.
Well, if I look at the player, I mean, if we look at the positive side of the player and we take the player outside of the typical, okay, I'm a player, I'm a video game, musician, or something to do with naturally is creative and flow inducing. What I've noticed is that being in that comfort focus in work could just be about how do you, okay, if I understand that in my case I like working with people, I way prefer working in a face-to-face conversation on the phone or face-to-face with voice versus writing emails and sending messages in chat. So I'll organize my work so that I get that comfort by working face-to-face as much as possible or having those synchronous conversations. But the example that pops to mind, if I think of the music industry, is that often musicians tend to have so much to juggle that they're not actually feeling their comfort that often. They often stretch out of their comfort zone, and then when they're in their comfort zone, they end up doing basically pretty shit stuff. So if I think the notion of flow really comes into this is where are you feeling flow? Where's the level of challenge versus the skill? How do you balance that? Obviously, the motivation is the centerpiece, but how do you balance your level of perceived challenge? Meaning, okay, if I increase the challenge, sometimes it's actually beneficial, even if it's not as comfortable. So the example I'm thinking of is one of my ex bosses who was one of these self-taught brand strategists who was amazing at his job, but he never really thought much about how he did his job. He was just really good at it, and he would do these slides for presentations on brand strategy, and the whole team working with him would be absolutely stretched out of their comfort zone, and he'd be bored. Like the day before we're presenting to a client, he'd be sitting on the computer going, hey, how about we change that slide here and change the title? And how about the layout? We do the different picture. And people would go mad. Like we'd had 3 or 4 graphic designers burning out because of his constant changing of the slides last minute. But he needed that level of challenge to be able to get into the comfort and be even in his flow. And that was at the expense of other people in this team. So once we realized that, we just basically allowed him to have that level of challenge without it costing the other people their own level of comfort and flow.
Mm,
So I think it's important to remember that the player is often quite a self-oriented archetype. The player is often about me, my comfort, rather than how does the team, how do the others around, how are they affected, if you like, by the comfort. So these first 2 archetypes, I see them very much as being self-oriented, whereas the third one, I see that as being something where you look at a group of people, a team, as the word manager suggests. So maybe we could look at that one a little bit and think, because the manager is not just in the context of a business, it can be somebody who's basically focused on adapting. So this archetype, like all the other parts, is a combination of this yin archetype in balance with this archetype, yang archetype. So inner focus, outer focus. So once somebody has understood their needs and what is their comfort zone and flow zone, then they can actually start to manage not just their own flow, but also a team's flow. And that the focus there is adaptation to what's going on. So it could be in a restaurant, constantly adapting to the flow of people. It could be in a game design. You design in this constant challenges and bug fixes. It could be in your work. Actually, you could be managing a team of therapists and constantly adapting to the challenges of that. So the manager is a usually team focus versus individual focus.
mm.
Like what about the manager in your work? Have you noticed how many? I mean, do you get a lot of managers come to your practice with?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, they're overrepresented in my practice because I work with typically people who have enough money to afford therapy.
Mm,
So
mm,
typically, I have more. executives and managers than factory workers. Not because I don't want to work with, the more working class people, but just because, yeah, because of the context in which I give therapy,
Mm.
that's how it's distributed. So I see a lot of them, and for the most common pressures that I observe there are systemic pressures. If you're a manager within a very dynamic, very stressful environment, it's very hard to resist the corporate machine, essentially. And it can be extremely dehumanizing and extremely violent in how impersonal it is. And
Mm.
that varies a lot, the work culture. And there I'm sorry to say that no culture is actually doing things perfectly. I think we need to realize there are very, very toxic things going on in Scandinavian work cultures. There are very, very toxic things going on in French work cultures. There are very toxic things going on in English, Anglo-Saxon work environments. No work environment has nailed it when it comes to really striking a balance between
Mm.
producing value and making sure that people thrive. And at many levels, there's still a very clear choice to mostly produce value and minimize damage to the people within the system, not let's try and make people as happy as much as they're producing value. That's very rarely the case. So that in itself can be a challenge, and then the challenge of dealing with that complex web of having to balance all these different players, to be attentive to not slipping into the savior role. I see this a lot, that people
Mm.
care about the people they work with, and they end up working unreasonable amounts of to just work ridiculous hours, just because they feel that they can't leave their teams to suffer. And very quickly that can slip into sacrifice, because there's always going to be someone to complain. There's always going to be something that's not perfect. So it requires some level of detachment and acceptance that it's never finished, it's never done, and you never know how well you're doing, because there's always someone that's telling you you're amazing, and there's always someone telling you that you're the absolute devil. So you have to deal with very high levels of uncertainty constantly. And yeah, it takes a life outside of work, and I think having grounding and enough confidence to be able to tolerate that much uncertainty.
Mm.
But there's also an equal amount of reward possible when balance is struck, and then you can really have something that feels good to be a part of and actually produces beautiful music, beautiful products, beautiful produce, whatever it is. It is possible, but then that generally requires really a lot of alignment of these specific factors: the human factor, the personality factor, meaning everyone has to be intrinsically motivated enough. And then it becomes like, if you think about brand identity, then it becomes one of
Mm.
those brands that people are proud to buy and proud to work for, and that are overwhelmingly seen as good. you know and typically those cannot be too big, because there's a moment where reaching a certain size prevents that human level, um, and that artisanal level quality. I think any high quality, really high quality product typically is going to be made at a small scale for a reason, because it becomes a nightmare whenever there's like 600 people involved on something. I don't want to be a part of that.
You being a therapist means that you're probably very good at asking questions. So, like, what would be the questions that you would go to? We call it do a Jonas on the manager role. What would be a good reflection question, or to sort of look at in terms of career choices? Let's say I'm a student wanting to choose a career path. Like, what do I need to ask myself for these archetypes?
I think, what do I expect this to give? Why am I doing this? Back to the basics. Why do anything?
Mm.
And then to specifically, I think, look at the question of structure. How well am I structuring my time individually, personally, and professionally, to protect my energy levels, to make sure that I am not sacrificing myself for my mission, and that I'm bringing
Mm.
my best self to the table, essentially, because um, it is very challenging to deal with that level of complexity. So go and do work experience before you choose to really become a manager. Like, go and see the reality, because, and this can be true of, I've heard this with, for example, criminal lawyers. They think they think they're ready for the job. They're ready to some extent, but they haven't realized certain pitfalls of the system, how flawed the actual legal system can be, how unreliable some of the players in that system are, how unprofessional certain colleagues are going to be, how absolutely nightmarish some of the clients can be. And
Mm.
after doing that for a certain number of years, it's really hard because you have the sunken cost fallacy, right? Like it's really hard to go back. But I've heard that from several people in those kind of types of jobs that, you have to really study hard for, and you have to, for
What
10
is
years
that?
of
Was
your life.
sunken cost fallacy? What is that?
Yeah, it's like even if you've lost at the casino, you keep playing because you think, well, I've already spent this much money, might as well keep it
Ah,
rolling.
okay.
My luck's going to change eventually, right? It's there's a lot of perceived effort when it comes to
Mm.
changing strategy, and it often feels less risky than doubling down on a failing strategy than to risk a new one. Somehow, it's like it's one of those cognitive biases. So it's something that I've heard a lot from these kind of professions. If I had known, maybe I would have done something else because this is a waste of
Mm.
my energy and I'm not actually doing what I thought I was going to be doing. So it's worth really double checking and figuring out what the reality of that job is going to be, and not thinking that it's like or like being a therapist. Like people often expect therapy to be a certain way because they've seen films, because they've seen series, and they're very surprised when it's not actually that. Pleasantly surprised most of the time. But yeah, there's really something about checking our representation, making sure that we have well, if we're being precise, understanding in what ways we don't have a good understanding or a good prediction of the future.
Mm.
Because the question, no one ever in the history of ever has accurately predicted the future. It's just a question of in what way do I know for sure that I'm going to be wrong? I'm scared of this. Okay, so I'm probably going to over anticipate that specific risk. I'm typically confident on that, so I'm going to underestimate that type of complexity, or whatever. What you see is all there is a common effect. If you, I don't know if
Mm.
you read Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow.
Kahneman, yeah.
Yep. So this idea that your brain fills the gaps, whatever information, what you see, that's all there is to build the story, and it's going to build a story. So if you don't have a lot of building blocks, it's going to be mostly a story about your own projective abilities in a way.
Mm. But when I look back to the path of economy, just to wrap things up, economy often people's first thinking is money, the
Mm,
currency of money. But we know already from looking at complex systems like nature, if you study ecology, you start to see that the values of looking at one single exchange of currencies hyper limited. It doesn't help us understand the complexity of an ecosystem. So one of the diagrams that I've used, I think we've shown this together before, but
mm,
if I zoom out so that you can see this and look at the this is one of my favorite diagrams for thinking about types of currencies that are actually way more interesting to look at when we think of the path of economy. It's not just the economy of money or the exchange of value around money, but there's the social currency of connection. People, like, you think of your LinkedIn network, the material capital of your natural resources, like your place where you live, your workplace, your tools, your money, of course, which is the one that most people think of, the living capital, the land, the ecosystem, your pets, and the idea capital, the intellectual capital. Now, in the music industry, I'm working a lot on exchange of intellectual capital around knowledge, around, for example, IP, and how to get your music licensed properly and get paid for it. But then there's also the experience capital, which is about how do you actually know, like you referred to with the lawyer, like knowing from practice rather than just from theory. And it goes on and on. There's like the spiritual capital, which actually is often not realized as a capital. People think of it as just something on the side, but it's actually a form of capital that you can have, the spiritual exchange, and it often is very connected to the cultural capital. They're often
mm,
intertwined, where it goes through story, through rites of passage, through community building. And I'm not just talking about religion. I'm talking about what are the meaningful moments in your community is very much cultural, spiritual capital. So when you look at it like this, and you're looking at the path of economy, it's interesting to consider that, like, path of economy is about how do you build a balanced exchange of currency and capital across all of those levels, How do you look at your needs on those levels? How do you look at your comfort and flow on those levels? And how do you adapt and go into this? The word trance here is not so much about being uh, out of the system. It's about being in this dynamic balance, like when you dance, like the spinning dervishes of the Middle East, when they're in this constant dance where you get into this flow. So as a maybe as an invitation for those who are using this archetype wheel to reflect on their next career step or next job, or even just like hobbies and reinventing their life, don't just limit yourself to thinking about money. Think about all the different dimensions of capital and value that you can be exchanging with people around you in the ecosystems and bubbles that you live in, really. And one question that I had on my mind that was like I was going to just put as a gift. Often we say that a question is worth more than anything else because it opens the thinking. So one of the questions I like to ask myself around the path of economy is, what are the needs that I'm actually mistaking for wants? In other words, where are my needs different to my wants? And that's a question I still haven't fully answered for myself, by the way. Maybe I need to go and see my therapist and ask that question again, Jonas. But do you have something that can help us distinguish between a need and a want? Because they're very, very fundamental.
It's a good question, but if I had to try and give something to reduce the complexity a little bit, I would say it's what happens when it's met. If a need is met, it disappears for a certain amount of time and then it comes back. It's like you're putting out a timer and then the need disappears until the next time where it needs to be met again. Think about the need for food, the need for sleep, the need for a hug, even. There's a moment where, and some people have a very fast clock. They need a hug immediately after the other one, and they might have attachment issues in that case. But if we simplify it, yeah, there's a timer that goes off and you extinguish it for a significant amount of time. A want, I think, is pretty much immediately displaced onto something more. You need transport, but you don't need a sports car. And what happens when you get a sports car and then another sports car and then another sports car is that typically you just want more sports cars. Your need for transport isn't just someday met. It's like, okay, I have 11 Lamborghinis. That was exactly the amount of transport that I needed. That's not how it works.
And actually, it reminds me of one thing you said to me a long time ago when I was asking you about just psychology in general. And you said to me, and this stuck, have you noticed that a lot of the issues with mental health are a warped or sort of twisted perception of time?
Yeah.
And now you bring that back with time, is that like the difference between a need and a want is that a need is over time, it just gets fulfilled and then comes back. Whereas a want doesn't disappear, it just stays over time.
Yeah. And I might have to introduce a bit of nuance there. I'm realizing, because if I'm thinking about the need for safety, for example, that one, once you're safe, normally it should stay like that. And if you're constantly needing to be reminded that you're safe, again, that might be indicative of trauma. And it might be something that's more problematic kind of underneath the surface. But generally, I think there's some of those needs have a longer clock than others, and some should be a little bit more permanent. But there's clearly this thing that whatever you want, it's never, the grass is always greener, right? No matter what you have, you're always going to want the next thing, but that's not what you need. And yeah, but it's I think there's more merit in asking oneself the question contextually regularly, and thinking about it in terms of proportion. To what degree is this a need? To what degree is this a want? Because generally those two get kind of combined together. But it's just already very useful to ask yourself the question, and to think beyond money when one thinks of value. I think is a very important one, because we often feel that, I don't think many of us feel like we have enough money or too much money, or at least I think in the people that surround me, it's not something that I hear ever. But what a lot of times we don't realize is all the stuff that we have that has value. Time. I am filthy rich in time. I'm definitely not rich in money, but I've deliberately carved out a life for myself where I have that time, and it is a luxury, but it's a necessity. If I know, me personally, if I don't have that time, I can't show up to my job meaningfully in the same way. I can't half-ass my job. I have to be focused. So if my heart's not in it, I can't do my job. So I know that that's a price I've had to pay. I've had to renounce money. I could work more, do more hours. I could do a 6-day work week or 5-day work week. But for me, that value of time exceeds the value of money on that specific thing. So I think, yeah, thank you for sharing that currency map. I think that's a very interesting way to look at it, and yeah, very easy to look at in practice.
Filthy rich as opposed to beautifully rich.
Oh, filthy rich, disgustingly rich. Yeah, I work
So
4 days a week. Most people like that. That just sounds. Even I judge myself when I look at it. And I look at the amount of energy that I have to expend in those 4 days, and then I don't feel so guilty. But still, 4 days a week is not. It's not too bad.
Indeed. So in terms of this archetype wheel, this is the path of economy, where if a person is listening to this and watching to sort of decide on what archetypes to combine, and the idea is that we're never in one single archetype. An archetype is a symbolic type of role that we play in our heads, first of all, and also with other people. And each of these archetypes can be combined with other archetypes. You can be a manager archetype combined with the servant archetype from the path of relation. And when you combine those archetypes and you combine them into a creative question, like how might I play the manager archetype with the servant archetype and the healing archetype, for example, which is something I heard from a student the other day that I was coaching, is how do you combine the healer with innovation? Or and it unlocks completely new ways of thinking about both your career, but also your personal growth and personal life, hobbies. And what I invite you to do is to not just think of these as this is my job, this is my career, I'm this. Defining yourself by that is quite dangerous because it becomes ego attachment. But rather looking at them as like a horse that you ride or car that you drive, and that you look at it and go, okay, I'm going to combine a bit of this archetype because this I like the spice in this one, I like the spice in that one, and get creative by combining them and thinking creatively with your friends or alone or even with your therapist about how might I embody these 2, 3, 4, 5 archetypes and unlock a new level of experience that I hadn't even thought was possible in my previous life.
Mm.
So Jonas, we've got one more recording to do, which will be the path of contemplation. I left it till last because obviously why shouldn't we leave the path of contemplation and contemplate on that and leave it to sit in the timelessness that it affords? But thank you very much for this, and we shall see each other soon in the beautiful nature of Finland. And meanwhile, I wish you a pleasant week. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me. Take good care.